My name is Donald Martinez, and I'm 67 years old, sitting here in my empty house in San Antonio, Texas, when my 28-year-old son Miguel died of a heroin overdose 3 months ago while recording a video on his phone blaming me for his addiction and promising the world that his father's lack of love was the reason he was about to kill himself. That video went viral with over 2 million views, and now I can't walk to the corner store without strangers staring at me like I'm the monster who murdered his own child with neglect and cruelty. I'd love to know where you're listening from today, so please share your location in the comments below. And if this story moves you, I hope you'll consider subscribing, because what happened to me shows how social media can destroy an innocent person's life with lies, and how a father's love can be twisted into evidence of hate by a son's addiction and desperation. Let me start by telling you who Miguel really was, and who I really am, because a viral video that destroyed my reputation told only the story that addiction wanted the world to hear. Miguel was born on Christmas Day in 1994, the most beautiful baby I had ever seen, with dark hair and bright brown eyes that seemed to take in everything around him with curiosity and wonder. His mother Elena and I had been married for 3 years, and Miguel was the miracle we had prayed for after 2 miscarriages that had nearly broken Elena's heart. I worked as a supervisor at a construction company, honest physical labor that paid well enough to support our small family and allowed us to buy a modest 3-bedroom house in a safe neighborhood on San Antonio's south side. Elena worked part-time as a receptionist at a medical clinic, and together we earned enough to provide Miguel with everything a child could need: his own bedroom, toys, books, and most importantly, 2 parents who loved him completely. Miguel was a bright, energetic child who filled our house with laughter and chaos in equal measure. He was curious about everything, always asking questions about how things worked, why the sky was blue, where rain came from. I loved those questions and spent hours explaining the world to him, teaching him about tools and construction, showing him how to use his hands to build and create things. When Miguel was 7 years old, our family faced its first major crisis when Elena was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. The diagnosis came suddenly, and the treatment was aggressive and exhausting. I took time off work to care for Elena and manage Miguel's schedule, driving him to school, helping with homework, and tried to maintain some sense of normalcy while our world was falling apart. Elena fought bravely for 2 years, enduring surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation with a determination that amazed everyone who knew her. Miguel was too young to fully understand what was happening, but he could see that his mother was sick and in pain. I tried to explain Elena's illness in terms he could understand while protecting him from the worst of our fears and struggles. Elena died when Miguel was 9 years old, and losing her devastated both of us. For months after the funeral, Miguel would wake up crying for his mother, and I would hold him until he fell back asleep. Both of us grieving the woman who had been the center of our lives. I was working full-time, managing household responsibilities, and trying to help a 9-year-old boy process the loss of his mother while dealing with my own overwhelming grief. Those years as a single father were the hardest of my life, but they were also when Miguel and I became closest. We developed our own routines and traditions, cooking dinner together, watching movies on weekends, working on homework at the kitchen table. I taught Miguel how to ride a bike, throw a baseball, and use basic tools. He helped me with yard work and household chores, and we learned to take care of each other. Miguel was an average student who struggled sometimes with reading and math, but excelled in art and music. He had a natural talent for drawing and could spend hours creating detailed pictures of cars, airplanes, and fantasy worlds. I encouraged his artistic interests, buying him art supplies, and signing him up for after-school programs where he could develop his skills. As Miguel entered his teenage years, I began to notice changes in his personality and behavior that worried me. He became more withdrawn and moody, spending long hours alone in his room, listening to music or drawing. His grades started to slip, and he began arguing with me about rules and expectations that had never been problems before. I attributed these changes to normal teenage development and the delayed effects of losing his mother at such a young age. I tried to be patient and understanding while maintaining the structure and discipline that I believed Miguel needed. I set reasonable rules about curfew, homework, and household responsibilities, and I enforced those rules consistently but fairly. But Miguel began to resent any form of authority or structure, viewing my rules as evidence that I didn't trust him or care about his feelings. He started lying about where he was going and who he was spending time with. He would come home late, ignore his homework, and react with anger and defiance when I tried to address these problems. When Miguel was 16, I discovered that he had been experimenting with marijuana and alcohol. I found drugs hidden in his room during a search that I conducted after smelling marijuana on his clothes. Miguel was furious about the invasion of his privacy and accused me of treating him like a criminal instead of trusting him to make good decisions. I responded by implementing stricter rules and closer supervision, which only made Miguel more rebellious and secretive. I required him to check in regularly when he was out, limited his social activities to weekends, and insisted on meeting his friends and their parents. Miguel viewed these measures as punishment rather than protection, and our relationship became increasingly strained. I also arranged for Miguel to meet with a counselor who specialized in teenage grief and substance abuse. The counselor explained that many teenagers who lose a parent early in life struggle with depression and turn to drugs or alcohol as a way of managing their emotional pain. She recommended family therapy to help us communicate better and rebuild our relationship. Miguel initially refused to participate in therapy, claiming that there was nothing wrong with him and that I was the one with problems. When I insisted that therapy was a condition of continuing to live in our house, he grudgingly attended sessions but remained hostile and uncooperative. The therapist tried to help us understand each other's perspectives, but Miguel seemed determined to view me as the enemy rather than as a father who was trying to help him. The situation worsened when Miguel started high school and began associating with older students who were known drug users. I tried to discourage these friendships by setting limits on Miguel's social activities and requiring him to spend more time at home. But these restrictions only drove him to become more secretive and deceptive about his whereabouts and activities. Miguel's drug use escalated from marijuana to prescription pills that he stole from medicine cabinets or bought from dealers at school. I discovered this progression when I found pill bottles hidden in his backpack and confronted him about where they had come from. Miguel claimed that he was just holding them for a friend, but his increasingly erratic behavior and physical symptoms made it clear that he was using these drugs regularly. I tried everything I could think of to help Miguel overcome his addiction. I enrolled him in outpatient treatment programs, arranged for drug testing, and even considered sending him to a residential treatment facility. But Miguel resented every attempt to control his drug use and viewed my efforts as evidence that I didn't love him unconditionally. The worst period came during Miguel's senior year, when he was caught selling drugs at school and faced criminal charges. I hired an attorney to help him avoid jail time, and we were able to negotiate a plea agreement that required Miguel to complete community service and attend drug counseling. But this legal trouble only made Miguel more angry and resentful toward me. Miguel blamed me for his arrest, claiming that my strict rules and lack of trust had driven him to sell drugs as a way of asserting his independence. He said that if I had been a better father who understood and supported him, he never would have gotten involved with drugs in the first place. This was the beginning of a narrative that Miguel would repeat for the rest of his life, that his addiction was my fault because I had failed to love him properly. After high school, Miguel moved out of our house and began living with friends who were also involved with drugs. I continued to offer help and support, paying for treatment programs, providing money for rent and food, and maintaining hope that he would eventually overcome his addiction and rebuild his life. But Miguel's drug use continued to escalate, and he began using heroin regularly. Over the next several years, Miguel went through multiple treatment programs, detox facilities, and sober living houses. I paid for every program, attended family sessions, and participated in interventions organized by counselors and social workers. But Miguel always relapsed, usually within weeks or months of completing treatment. Each relapse was accompanied by accusations that I was to blame for his continued drug use. Miguel claimed that my failure to show love and support during his childhood had created the emotional wounds that drove him to drugs. He said that other fathers would have been more understanding and patient, and that my strict parenting had damaged him psychologically. These accusations were devastating and confusing because they contradicted everything I believed about our relationship and my efforts to be a good father. I had worked 2 jobs to support us after Elena's death, attended every school event and baseball game, helped with homework every night, and sacrificed my own social life to focus on raising Miguel. I couldn't understand how love and dedication could be reinterpreted as neglect and abuse. I began to question my own memories and perceptions, wondering if Miguel might be right about my failures as a father. I consulted with therapists and counselors who assured me that I had done everything possible to help Miguel, but his accusations continued to eat away at my confidence and self-worth. Miguel's addiction destroyed every relationship in his life. He lost jobs, apartments, and friendships because of his drug use. He stole money from friends and family members to buy heroin, and he manipulated people with promises of sobriety that he never kept. But through everything, he maintained that his addiction was not his fault, but the result of my inadequate parenting. In the months before his death, Miguel had been living in a series of temporary arrangements, crashing with friends or staying in cheap motels when he could afford them. He had been using social media to document his struggles with addiction, posting videos about his life on the streets and his battles with heroin. These videos often included references to his childhood and his belief that his father's lack of love had driven him to drugs. I wasn't aware of these social media posts because Miguel had blocked me from his accounts years earlier. I learned about them only after his death, when friends and strangers began sharing them and using them as evidence of my failure as a parent. In these videos, Miguel presented himself as a victim of parental neglect who had turned to drugs as a way of coping with emotional abandonment. The final video, the one that would destroy my life, was recorded on the day Miguel died. He had obtained a large quantity of heroin and had apparently decided to end his life by overdosing while documenting his final moments for social media. In the video, he spoke directly to the camera, explaining that he was about to kill himself and that his father's lack of love was the reason he couldn't continue living. Miguel described me as a cold, unloving man who had never shown him affection or support. He claimed that I had been more interested in controlling him than understanding him, and that my harsh parenting had created the depression and self-hatred that led to his addiction. He said that his death would be on my conscience, and that I would have to live with the knowledge that I had driven my own son to suicide. The video lasted nearly 20 minutes, with Miguel becoming increasingly emotional as he prepared to inject a fatal dose of heroin. He spoke about feeling unloved and unwanted throughout his life, about believing that his father viewed him as a burden rather than a blessing. He said that his death would finally free both of us from the disappointment and pain that our relationship had caused. Miguel died alone in an abandoned building, with his phone still recording as the heroin stopped his heart. Someone found his body hours later and uploaded the video to multiple social media platforms before calling the police. By the time I was notified of Miguel's death, the video had already been viewed thousands of times and was spreading rapidly across the internet. The impact was immediate and devastating. The video was shared on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, with viewers expressing outrage at the father who had allegedly driven his son to suicide through neglect and cruelty. Comments poured in from strangers who condemned me as a monster, a failure, and a murderer who had killed his child with indifference. Local news stations picked up the story, presenting it as a cautionary tale about the importance of parental love and the tragic consequences of family dysfunction. I was contacted by reporters who wanted me to respond to Miguel's accusations, but I was too devastated by grief and shock to provide coherent answers to their questions. The viral nature of the video meant that my personal information was quickly discovered and shared online. My address, phone number, and workplace were posted on social media, along with encouragement for people to contact me and express their opinions about my parenting. I began receiving hundreds of phone calls, emails, and text messages from strangers who wanted to tell me what they thought about fathers who drive their children to suicide. Some of the messages were threatening, with people suggesting that I deserved to die for what I had done to Miguel. Others were expressions of disgust and condemnation, calling me names and describing me as the worst kind of parent. A few people defended me or suggested that addiction was a complex disease that couldn't be blamed on any single factor, but these voices were overwhelmed by the chorus of condemnation. The harassment extended beyond social media into my real life. Protesters gathered outside my house, holding signs with Miguel's picture and messages about parental responsibility. Someone spray-painted child killer on my garage door, and my mailbox was vandalized repeatedly. Neighbors who had known me for years began avoiding eye contact and crossing the street when they saw me coming. My employer, a large construction company that was concerned about negative publicity, placed me on administrative leave while they conducted an investigation into the allegations made in Miguel's video. Although there were no formal charges or legal proceedings, the company was worried about the impact on their reputation if they continued to employ someone who was being portrayed as an abusive parent. The investigation was eventually dropped, and I was allowed to return to work, but the damage to my professional relationships was significant. Co-workers who had been friendly for years now treated me with suspicion and discomfort. Some people at work had seen the video and believed Miguel's version of events, while others simply wanted to avoid being associated with someone who had become notorious on social media. The social isolation was overwhelming. Friends stopped calling and visiting, either because they believed the accusations against me or because they didn't want to be connected to the controversy. Church members avoided me, and I eventually stopped attending services because of the stares and whispers that followed me everywhere. Shopping for groceries became an ordeal as strangers recognized me from news coverage and social media posts. Some people would point and whisper when they saw me, while others would approach directly to express their opinions about my parenting. I began driving to stores in other neighborhoods to avoid these confrontations, but even then, I never knew when someone might recognize me and create a scene. The worst part was the constant second-guessing and self-doubt that Miguel's accusations had planted in my mind. Despite knowing the truth about our relationship and my efforts to help him, I found myself wondering if I had somehow failed him in ways I couldn't see or understand. The grief of losing my son was complicated by guilt and confusion about whether I was responsible for his death. I began seeing a therapist who specialized in family grief and trauma, and she helped me understand that Miguel's accusations were likely to result as addiction rather than accurate reflections of our relationship. She explained that people struggling with severe addiction often blame others for their problems as a way of avoiding responsibility for their own choices and actions. The therapist also helped me understand that Miguel's video was created during a moment of extreme desperation and mental illness, when his judgment was impaired by drugs and suicidal thoughts. She suggested that the son who had loved me and depended on me for years was not the same person who had made those final accusations, and that I should remember the real Miguel rather than the distorted version that addiction had created. But understanding the psychological factors behind Miguel's accusations didn't undo the damage they had caused to my reputation and relationships. The viral video had created a public narrative about my character that was impossible to counteract or correct. Once someone is labeled as an abusive parent on social media, that label tends to stick regardless of evidence to the contrary. I considered moving to a different city where no one would know my story, but at 67 years old, starting over seemed almost impossible. I had built a life in San Antonio over decades, and the thought of abandoning everything because of lies and misunderstandings was heartbreaking. I also worried that running away would be seen as an admission of guilt, further confirming the narrative that Miguel had created. Instead, I decided to stay and try to rebuild my life while carrying the burden of false accusations and social stigma. I focused on work, therapy, and the few relationships that had survived the controversy. I also began volunteering with organizations that help families affected by addiction, hoping to find some meaning and purpose in my experience. It was through this volunteer work that I met Dr. Patricia Hernandez, a psychiatrist who specializes in addiction and family trauma. Dr. Hernandez had seen Miguel's video and was disturbed by the way it had been used to blame a father for his son's addiction. She offered to help me understand what had really happened and to find ways to honor Miguel's memory while protecting my own mental health. Dr. Hernandez explained that Miguel's accusations were consistent with psychological phenomenon called scapegoating, where people with severe mental illness or addiction blame family members for problems that are actually caused by their condition. She said that parents of addicted children often become targets of misplaced anger and resentment, even when they have done everything possible to help. She also helped me understand that Miguel's video was not a rational assessment of our relationship, but a product of severe depression, addiction, and suicidal thinking. In his final hours, Miguel was not capable of accurate judgment about his life or the people who had tried to help him. The video represented the voice of addiction and mental illness, not the voice of my son. But the most significant development came when Dr. Hernandez connected me with other parents who had lost children to overdoses and had been blamed by their addicted children for their deaths. I discovered that Miguel's accusations were not unique, and that many families affected by addiction have experienced similar scapegoating and false blame. This community of grieving parents became a source of support and understanding that I had been lacking since Miguel's death. They helped me see that I was not alone in this experience, and that the guilt and shame I was carrying were not justified by the facts of my relationship with Miguel. Together, we began working on a project to educate the public about the realities of addiction and the harm that can be caused by viral videos that blame families for complex medical and psychological problems. We created a website and social media presence dedicated to sharing accurate information about addiction and supporting families who have been unfairly blamed for their children's substance abuse. Our advocacy work began to attract attention from medical professionals, addiction specialists, and journalists who understood the complexity of addiction and the danger of oversimplified explanations for tragic deaths. Slowly, a counter-narrative began to emerge that challenged the assumptions underlying Miguel's viral video. 6 months after Miguel's death, a documentary filmmaker who had been following our advocacy work approached me about creating a film that would tell the full story of our relationship and challenge the false narrative that had destroyed my reputation. The filmmaker had lost her own brother to addiction and understood how families could be unfairly blamed for tragedies beyond their control. The documentary process was emotionally difficult, but ultimately healing. It allowed me to share memories of Miguel's childhood, examples of my efforts to help him overcome addiction, and evidence of the love and support I have provided throughout his life. The film also included interviews with therapists, addiction specialists, and other families who had experienced similar tragedies. When the documentary was released, it began to change public perception of my story and Miguel's death. Viewers who had originally condemned me based on a viral video began to understand the complexity of addiction and the unfairness of blaming parents for their children's substance abuse. The film sparked important conversations about mental health, addiction, and the responsibility of social media platforms to prevent the spread of harmful misinformation. Most importantly, the documentary helped me reclaim Miguel's memory from the distortion of his final video. I was able to share stories about the loving, creative, curious child he had been before addiction changed him. I could honor the real Miguel while acknowledging the tragedy of how addiction had warped his perceptions and destroyed his life. Today, 3 years after Miguel's death, I continue to live in San Antonio and work with families affected by addiction. The social stigma hasn't completely disappeared, but it has lessened significantly as more people have learned the truth about our relationship and the realities of addiction. I've been able to rebuild some friendships and find new sources of community and support. The work I do now feels like a way of honoring Miguel's memory, while preventing other families from experiencing the kind of false blame and public shaming that I endured. Every parent I help understand that addiction is a disease, not a moral failing, feels like a small victory against the ignorance and cruelty that Miguel's video unleashed. I still miss Miguel every day, and I still struggle with grief and regret about not being able to save him from addiction. But I no longer carry the guilt and shame that his false accusations had imposed on me. I know that I loved my son completely and did everything possible to help him, and that his death was a result of a terrible disease, not parental failure. That's my story. How my son's dying video blamed me for his addiction and turned me into a social pariah, but how the truth eventually emerged and helped heal both my reputation and my heart. Sometimes the people we love most will hurt us deeply when they're consumed by illness and desperation, but sometimes the truth has the power to set us free from false accusations and restore our dignity.